Time distortion. You glance at the clock. 5 minutes. But it feels like an hour. You're waiting for a text, sitting alone, and every second drags. Then later, you're deep into something you care about, completely absorbed, and 2 hours vanish. You look up, and the day is gone. Time doesn't move at a steady pace. Not in your head. The clock ticks forward the same way it always does, but how you experience it shifts constantly. It bends. It warps. It stretches and compresses depending on what you're doing and how you're feeling. This is time distortion. The gap between how long something actually takes and how long it feels. And it's not random. Your brain doesn't measure time like a stopwatch. It builds your sense of duration from the experiences you're processing. When you're bored, waiting, anxious, there's nothing new happening. Your mind has nothing to hold onto, so your attention fixates on time itself. And that makes every moment feel heavier, longer, unbearable. The brain keeps asking, has it been long enough yet? Each time it checks, the feeling that time has slowed gets stronger. But when you're engaged, the opposite happens. Your attention is locked somewhere else. You're inside the task, the conversation, the flow. You're not tracking time anymore. There's no mental space left for it. The hours compress. You only notice when it's over, when you surface and realize how much time passed without you feeling it. A dull meeting feels endless. An engaging conversation flies by. Waiting for news stretches time into agony. Working on something you care about makes it vanish. The content of your experience determines its length. Emotion warps time too. Fear stretches it. In moments of danger, your brain shifts into overdrive. It processes more information per second to help you react. Afterward, when you replay the memory, it feels like it lasted longer than it did. Your mind recorded so much detail. A car swerving toward you, a sudden fall. These moments expand in memory even though they passed in an instant. Novelty does the same. The first time you go somewhere new, the days feel long and full. You return home, fall back into routine, and weeks blur together. Unfamiliar experiences create more mental markers, more detail. Time feels richer, slower. Repetition erases those markers. The brain stops paying attention to what's predictable. The days compress into a featureless streak. This is why childhood feels endless and adulthood accelerates. When you're young, everything is new. Every year is packed with first experiences. Your brain encodes them in vivid detail. But as you age, routines take over. Fewer surprises. Less novelty. The years blend together because there's less to separate one from the next. Your brain doesn't measure time. It constructs it. From memory. From attention. And that construction can stretch, compress, or completely rewrite itself depending on what you're living through. Present bias. You know you should save money. You know you should start early, go to the gym, plan for later. But right now, there's something easier. Something immediate. Something that feels better in this exact moment. So you take it. And the future version of yourself, the one who'll deal with the consequences, feels distant. Almost hypothetical. Like someone else's problem. This is present bias. The tendency to overvalue what's in front of you and discount what comes later. Even when the future cost is obviously higher. It's not that you don't know better. You do. But the pull of now is stronger than the logic of later. Your brain is built to prioritize the present. Immediate rewards trigger a stronger response than delayed ones. Even when the delayed reward is objectively better. The brain's reward system runs on dopamine. And dopamine responds most powerfully to things that are certain and close. A guaranteed pleasure now feels more real than a larger benefit months away. The future is abstract. The present is vivid. This is why you skip the gym today even though you want to be healthier next year. Why you choose scrolling now instead of working on something that matters later. The future benefit exists in theory. but it doesn't activate the same circuits. It doesn't feel urgent. It doesn't feel necessary. Not the way the thing you can have right now does. The gap widens with distance. The further away a reward is, the less it affects your choices. $1,000 today feels more valuable than $1,500 in a year. Rationally, waiting is better, but the brain doesn't compute value rationally when emotion is involved. It computes based on immediacy and certainty. And the present always wins. This shows up everywhere. Procrastination. The comfort of avoiding work now outweighs the stress of a deadline later. Spending. The satisfaction of buying something today beats the abstract idea of financial security tomorrow. Health. The pleasure of a meal or the ease of skipping exercise overrides the distant concept of future well-being. It gets worse under stress. When you're tired, anxious, overwhelmed, your capacity for long-term thinking shrinks. The future feels even more remote, even less real. So you default to whatever offers relief in the moment, even if it makes tomorrow harder. It's not weakness. It's how the system works. Present bias doesn't mean you don't care about the future. It means the future doesn't feel as real as the present. And because of that, you make decisions that favor now over later. Even when you know you'll regret it. The version of yourself that exists 6 months from now isn't standing in front of you. You can't see them. You can't feel their consequences. You can't hear them object. So their needs don't register with the same weight. They're theoretical. And theory loses to immediacy every time. Boredom time dilation. Nothing is happening. You're stuck in a conversation you don't care about, sitting through a presentation that lost you 10 minutes ago, waiting in a room with nothing to do. The clock hasn't moved. Or it has, but only barely. Every minute feels like it's being stretched thin, pulled out until it becomes something heavy and impossible to escape. Boredom doesn't just make time feel slow. It makes it feel suffocating. The mechanism is simple. When there's nothing engaging your attention, your mind defaults to monitoring time itself. There's no task to lose yourself in, no conversation pulling you forward, no challenge holding your focus. So the brain turns inward and starts checking. How much longer? Has anything changed? And every check makes you more aware of how slowly time is moving. It's a feedback loop. The more bored you are, the more you notice time. The more you notice time, the slower it feels. And the slower it feels, the more unbearable the experience becomes. Engagement pulls attention away from the clock. But boredom locks you onto it. You're hyper-aware of every second because there's nothing else to occupy your mind. The experience becomes about waiting, not doing. And waiting without purpose feels endless. This is why a boring lecture feels twice as long as it actually is. Why a slow workday drags while a busy one flies. Why sitting alone with your thoughts in a quiet room can make 10 minutes feel like an hour. The absence of stimulation creates a void, and your brain fills it by obsessing over duration. It shows up in relationships too. A conversation with someone who doesn't interest you stretches on forever. You're watching the clock, counting down, desperate for it to end. But when you're talking to someone you connect with, hours disappear. The difference isn't the time. It's where your attention goes. The worst part is that you can't force engagement. You can't will yourself to stop being bored. The more you try to ignore how slow time feels, the more aware of it you become. So you're stuck, trapped in a moment that refuses to pass. And the only way out is for something, anything to finally change. Temporal discounting. Imagine 2 options. $100 today or $150 next month. Rationally, waiting makes sense. It's more money for doing nothing. But most people take the 100 now. The extra 50 doesn't feel real enough to justify the delay. The further away a reward is, the less you value it. Not because you don't want it, but because distance erodes its weight. Your brain discounts future gains automatically, shrinking their importance the moment they're not immediate. And the effect is so strong that you'll choose less now over more later, even when you know it's the worst deal. Temporal discounting is the reason long-term plans kill under short-term temptation. The payoff is too far away. It doesn't trigger the same response as something you can have right now. So you choose the smaller, immediate reward. And the future cost doesn't register until it's too late. This happens because your brain values certainty over potential. A reward you can see and touch today is guaranteed. A reward next month is abstract. It exists in theory, but theory doesn't move you the way reality does. So even when the delayed option is objectively better, the immediate one feels more valuable. The discount rate steepens with time. A reward 1 week away loses some value. A reward 1 year away loses most of it. This is why saving for retirement feels impossible, while spending on something today feels effortless. The retirement benefit is decades out. It's so distant it barely registers as real. But the satisfaction of buying something now is immediate and certain. You see it in every decision that sacrifices the future for the present. Skipping savings to buy something you want. Choosing comfort today over health tomorrow. Avoiding work now even though the deadline is approaching. The future version of the reward exists, but it's too far away to compete with what's in front of you. The mechanism doesn't care about logic. It's automatic. Wired into how your brain processes value. And because of that, you'll consistently make choices that feel right in the moment but hurt you later. Not because you're irrational, but because immediacy always weighs more than distance. Fair time slowing. The car swerves into your lane. You don't have time to think. But somehow the moment stretches. You see everything. The angle of the headlights, the texture of the road, the exact position of your hands on the wheel. It feels like it lasts forever. But when it's over, you realize it was only a second. Maybe less. Fear doesn't actually slow time. It just makes your brain record more. In moments of danger, your system floods with adrenaline. Your attention sharpens. Your senses heighten. And your mind starts processing information faster than normal, capturing every detail it can to help you react. Later, when you replay the memory, it feels longer than it was. Because your brain encoded so much, there's more to remember. More sensory input. More emotional weight. So the event expands in your mind, even though the clock didn't slow down at all. This is why accidents feel like they happen in slow motion. Why a fall seems to last forever. Why a sudden confrontation stretches out in your head even though it passed in seconds. Your brain was working overtime, and the density of that experience created the illusion of extended time. The same thing happens in any high-stress moment. A public speaking disaster. A near miss on the highway. A moment of panic when you think you've lost something critical. The experience feels drawn out because your mind was hypervigilant, processing everything at maximum capacity. But it only happens in retrospect. In the moment, you're not thinking about time at all. You're reacting. It's only when you look back that the distortion appears. The memory is so vivid, so packed with detail, that it feels like it must have taken longer than it did. And that's the trick. Time didn't slow. Your brain just refused to let the moment blur. It held on to everything, encoding it with a clarity that normal moments don't get. So when you replay it, the richness of the memory makes it feel like time itself bent. But it was just your mind, doing what it's built to do when survival feels like it's on the line. Waiting psychology. You're waiting for a reply, a decision, test results, the start of something you've been looking forward to for weeks. And the waiting feels worse than anything else. Worse than the outcome itself, whatever it turns out to be. Because while you're waiting, you're suspended. You can't move forward. You can't let go. You're stuck in a state where nothing resolves and nothing progresses. Waiting isn't passive. It's active torture. Your mind loops. You check your phone. You replay scenarios. You imagine what might happen, then imagine the opposite, then imagine everything in between. The uncertainty keeps you locked in place, unable to settle, unable to focus on anything else. And time moves differently when you're waiting. Every minute feels longer because your attention is fixed on the thing that hasn't happened yet. You're monitoring for updates constantly, checking for signs of change. And because you're watching the clock, every second registers as a delay. The more you want the wait to be over, the slower it feels. This is why waiting for important news is excruciating. Why anticipating something you care about makes the days drag. Why queuing for anything turns minutes into psychological endurance tests. The outcome matters. So your brain can't let go. It stays alert, vigilant, locked onto the moment the wait will finally end. It gets worse when the wait is uncertain. If you know exactly how long something will take, you can mentally prepare. But when the timeline is vague, the uncertainty multiplies the stress. You don't know if it's minutes or hours or days. So you stay on edge, constantly checking, unable to relax because you might miss the moment it finally happens. Waiting also amplifies whatever emotion is at stake to the outcome. If you're anxious, the wait intensifies the anxiety. If you're excited, the wait becomes almost unbearable anticipation. The delay doesn't just stretch time. It magnifies the feeling, turning the wait into something that feels bigger than the event itself. And when it finally ends, the relief is immediate. But the time you spent waiting doesn't vanish. It lingers. You remember how long it felt, how much mental energy it consumed, how stuck you were while it lasted. Waiting doesn't just distort time. It steals focus, drains patience, and makes every second feel like a burden you can't put down until someone else decides it's over. Retrospective duration judgment. Think about your last vacation. How long did it feel? If you're like most people, it probably felt shorter than it actually was. A week away feels like it passed in days. But ask someone how long a boring work week felt, and they'll tell you it dragged on forever. Same amount of time. Completely different experience. The difference isn't in the clock. It's in what you remember. When you judge how long something lasted after the fact, you're not recalling the actual duration. You're reconstructing it from memory. And memory doesn't preserve time. It preserves events. The more distinct moments you encoded, the longer the period feels in retrospect. A week packed with new experiences, different locations, unexpected events creates more mental markers, more things to remember. So when you look back, it feels fuller, richer, longer. But a week of routine doing the same thing every day leaves almost no markers. The days blur together. There's nothing distinct to separate Monday from Thursday. So in memory, the whole week compresses into a vague stretch of sameness. It feels short because there's barely anything there. This is why people say time flies as they get older. Childhood feels endless because everything is new. You're encoding constantly. But as an adult, routines take over. Weeks repeat, years blend. There are fewer novel experiences to anchor your memory, so looking back, the time feels like it passed faster than it did. The effect reverses when you're in the moment. During a boring stretch, time drags because you're hyper-aware of it. But afterward, when you try to recall it, there's nothing to hold on to. The memory collapses. So retrospectively, it feels brief. A busy, engaging period works the opposite way. In the moment, time flies because you're absorbed. But when you look back, the density of what you experience makes it feel longer. You remember more. So it expands in memory even though it compressed in real time. Your brain doesn't store duration directly. It infers it from the richness of what you encoded. And that means your sense of how long something lasted depends entirely on what you were paying attention to while it happened. Urgency bias. The email says urgent. The message says it can't wait. Someone tells you they need an answer now, and suddenly everything else fades. It doesn't matter that you were in the middle of something important. The word urgent hijacks your attention, and you drop everything to respond. Urgency doesn't care about importance. It just demands immediacy. And your brain is wired to prioritize it. When something is labeled urgent, it triggers a response that overrides rational evaluation. You react first. You assess whether it actually mattered later. This is urgency bias. The tendency to treat anything framed as time-sensitive as more important than it actually is. It shows up in every part of life. Work emails marked urgent that could have waited. Texts demanding immediate replies. Notifications designed to make you feel like you're missing something critical if you don't check right now. The mechanism is simple. Urgency creates a sense of scarcity. Time is running out. You have to act before the window closes. And scarcity activates stress. Your brain interprets the urgency signal as a threat. Not a physical one, but a social or professional one. Miss the deadline, and there will be consequences. So you respond, even when the so-called urgent thing is trivial. Even when responding means abandoning something that actually matters. Because urgency feels like it can't wait. And the pressure to act now is stronger than the logic of prioritizing what's truly important. This is why people get trapped in reactive loops. Constantly putting out fires. Always responding to the next urgent request. Never making progress on the things that actually move them forward. Urgency demands attention. Importance requires reflection. And when the two compete, urgency wins. It gets worse in environments designed to exploit it. Workplaces where everything is marked urgent. Social platforms engineered to create artificial time pressure. Notifications that make every message feel like it needs an immediate response. The more often you're exposed to urgency signals, the more conditioned you become to react without thinking. And the trap is that most urgent things aren't. They're just framed that way. Someone else's poor planning becomes your emergency. A task that could wait gets escalated because urgency makes it feel more important. And you comply because the pressure to respond now overrides your ability to evaluate whether it actually deserves your attention. Urgency hijacks priority, and once it does, you stop deciding what matters. You just react to whatever screams the loudest. Prospective timing. You think you know how long things take. You've done this task before. You estimate it'll take an hour, maybe 2. You schedule accordingly. Then you start. And 3 hours later, you're still not done. The estimate wasn't even close. Prospective timing is your attempt to predict duration before it happens. And you're consistently bad at it. Not because you're careless, but because your brain underestimates complexity and overestimates efficiency. You plan for the ideal version of the task, not the real one. When you estimate how long something will take, you're imagining the process without interruptions, without mistakes, without the small delays that pile up. You picture yourself working steadily, everything going smoothly, finishing right on schedule. But that's not how tasks actually unfold. Reality includes friction. You get stuck. You realize something is more complicated than you thought. You have to redo parts. You get interrupted. And all of that eats time you didn't account for. So the task takes longer. Not because you were wrong about the work itself, but because you didn't factor in everything that slows it down. This is the planning fallacy, the systematic tendency to underestimate how long things will take. And it's not just about optimism. It's about how your brain models the future. When you imagine doing something, you simulate the ideal path, the version where nothing goes wrong. And that simulation feels accurate, so you base your estimate on it. But the ideal path almost never happens. There are always variables you didn't anticipate, complications you couldn't predict, small inefficiencies that add up. And because you didn't include them in your mental model, your estimate falls short. This shows up everywhere. Projects that run over schedule. Trips that take longer than expected. Tasks you thought would be quick that consume your entire afternoon. You weren't lying to yourself. You genuinely believed the estimate. But you were predicting the best case, not the average one. The effect compounds when you're under pressure. The more you need something to be fast, the more you convince yourself it will be. You shrink the estimate to fit your timeline, not reality. And when it takes longer, you're caught off guard. Prospective timing fails because you're not predicting duration. You're predicting an idealized version of effort. And effort is always messier than you think. Future self-continuity. Who is the person you'll be in 10 years? Do you feel connected to them? Can you picture their life, their concerns, their regrets? Or do they feel distant, abstract, like someone you don't really know? For most people, the future self is a stranger. You can intellectually acknowledge that it's you. But emotionally, they don't register the same way your present self does. And that disconnect has consequences. When your future self feels distant, you don't prioritize their needs. You make decisions that favor you now at their expense. Skip saving because future you will deal with it. Choose comfort today because future you stress feels hypothetical. Avoid preparing for something difficult because the version of you who'll face it doesn't feel real enough to protect. This is low future self-continuity. The weaker your sense of connection to your future self, the less you care about their well-being. And the less you care, the more short-sighted your decisions become. The mechanism runs on emotional proximity. Your present self is vivid, immediate. You feel their desires, their discomfort, their needs directly. But your future self exists only in imagination. You can't feel what they'll feel. You can't experience their consequences. So they don't move you the way your present self does. And that gap creates a failure of empathy. You wouldn't ignore a friend's future struggles. You wouldn't dismiss someone else's long-term well-being. But your future self is abstract enough that you treat them the way you'd treat a stranger, with less consideration, less concern. This is why people sabotage their own futures. They're not being irrational. They're being human. The brain is designed to prioritize the immediate and tangible over the distant and abstract. And your future self, no matter how logically you understand their you, feels distant and abstract. The weaker the continuity, the worse the trade-offs. Sacrificing future health for present pleasure. Trading future financial stability for immediate spending. Choosing short-term relief over long-term progress. Each decision makes sense in the moment because the future self who'll pay the price doesn't feel real. Some people have stronger future self-continuity. They can vividly imagine their future. They feel connected to the person they'll become. And that connection changes their decisions. They save more. They invest in long-term goals. They endure short-term discomfort because they genuinely care about the person who'll benefit from it. But for most, the future self is too far away to feel like someone worth protecting. And that distance turns every decision into a choice between someone you know and someone you don't. The present self always wins. Time pressure distortion. The clock is ticking. You have less time than you need. And suddenly everything changes. Your focus sharpens. Distractions disappear. You move faster, work harder, cut through decisions you'd normally agonize over. Under pressure, you become efficient in ways you never are when time feels abundant. But there's a cost. Time pressure doesn't just make you faster. It makes you different. You stop thinking carefully. You miss details. You make choices based on speed, not quality. And the tighter the deadline, the more your judgment warps. When time is scarce, your brain shifts into a narrower mode. It prioritizes completion over correctness. Getting it done becomes more important than getting it right. and that shift happens automatically. You're not consciously deciding to lower your standards. The pressure rewires how you evaluate what matters. This is why people make worse decisions under tight deadlines. Not because they're panicking, but because time pressure changes the criteria. When you have time, you consider options. You weigh trade-offs. You think about consequences. But when time is running out, those processes compress. You grab the first solution that works. You skip the analysis. You move. The distortion goes both ways. Under extreme pressure, time can feel like it's moving faster than it is. The deadline looms, and you're hyper-aware of every passing second. You feel rushed even when you're working at your normal pace. The scarcity creates urgency, and urgency amplifies the sensation of time slipping away. But sometimes, pressure creates the opposite effect. In high-stakes moments, time can feel like it slows. Athletes talk about the game slowing down. Everything becomes clearer, more deliberate. The pressure forces such intense focus that you process more per second, and the richness of that processing makes the moment feel extended. Either way, time pressure changes how you operate. It forces trade-offs, speed over depth, action over reflection, and the tighter the constraint, the more those trade-offs define the outcome. This is why procrastinators often perform well under pressure. The deadline creates focus they can't generate on their own. But it also guarantees they're working in a distorted state. Faster, yes, but also shallower. Missing nuances. Making errors they'd catch if they had more time. Time pressure doesn't reveal your best work. It reveals what you can produce when accuracy becomes optional and completion becomes everything. Deadline acceleration effect. You have 2 weeks. Plenty of time. No need to start yet. You'll get to it. Then 1 week. Still fine. You've done this before. A few days. Okay, now it's real. And suddenly, the last 48 hours become a frantic sprint where you accomplish more than you did in the entire week before. Deadlines don't distribute effort evenly. They concentrate it. The closer you get, the faster you work. Not because the task changed, but because the deadline makes time feel scarce. And scarcity creates urgency, and urgency drives action. This is the deadline acceleration effect, the pattern where productivity surges as the deadline approaches. You're capable of working at that pace the entire time, but you don't, not until the pressure forces it. The reason is simple. When the deadline is far away, it doesn't feel real. There's no immediate consequence to delaying. So other things take priority, easier tasks, less demanding work, distractions that wouldn't stand a chance if the deadline were tomorrow. But with time to spare, they win. As the deadline gets closer, the cost of delay becomes tangible. You start losing the buffer. What was once 2 weeks is now 2 days. And 2 days isn't enough to be careless. So you shift. You cut distractions. You focus. You work faster because you have to. The acceleration isn't about ability. It's about motivation. The distant deadline doesn't activate the stress response that drives urgency. But the looming one does. Your brain treats the approaching deadline as a threat. And threats demand action. This is why people procrastinate even when they know it hurts them. The deadline creates the pressure they need to override inertia. Without it, the task stays abstract. With it, the task becomes urgent. And urgency is the only thing strong enough to cut through resistance. But the cost is real. Working under deadline pressure means working in crisis mode. You're faster, but you're also shallower. You skip steps. You make mistakes. You deliver something functional, but not your best work. The acceleration gets the task done. But it doesn't optimize the outcome. And the pattern reinforces itself. Every time you procrastinate and still meet the deadline, you learn that the last-minute sprint works. So you repeat it. The acceleration becomes your default. Not because it's efficient, but because it's the only mode that generates enough urgency to overcome delay. The deadline accelerates effort, but it also guarantees you'll always be working under pressure. And pressure distorts judgment, so the work gets done, but never as well as it could have if you'd started when time still felt abundant. Flow time compression. You sit down to work. Something clicks. The task pulls you in. Your attention locks. Distractions fade. You're not thinking about what you're doing. You're just doing it. Hours pass. You look up and it's dark outside. You had no idea. This is flow, the state where you're so absorbed that time disappears. Not because it's boring, but because you're completely engaged. And when you're engaged, your brain stops monitoring duration. It stops checking the clock. It stops asking how much longer. All of that mental space goes into the task itself. Flow happens when challenge and skill align. The work is hard enough to hold your attention, but not so hard that you get stuck. You're stretched, but not broken. And in that zone, time compresses. Not because it's moving faster, but because you're not watching it move. The mechanism is simple. Time awareness requires attention. When you're bored or waiting, you have attention to spare. So you notice time. You track it. You feel every minute. But in flow, there's no spare attention. Everything is occupied. The task consumes your focus so completely that time becomes invisible. This is why creative work, deep problem solving, and intense conversation can make hours feel like minutes. You're not distracted. You're not multitasking. You're locked in. And the deeper the lock, the faster time seems to pass. It's the opposite of boredom. Boredom stretches time because there's nothing to hold your focus. Flow compresses it because there's too much. The difference isn't in the clock. It's in where your mind is. But flow doesn't last forever. Eventually, you surface. You check the time and realize how long you've been working. And the realization is often a shock. The hours didn't feel like hours. They felt like a continuous present. One long, unbroken stretch where past and future didn't matter. Only now. And when it's over, you remember the work. You remember what you accomplished. But you don't remember the time, because while you were in flow, time wasn't part of the experience. It was just background, irrelevant. Anxious time expansion. You're waiting for results, a diagnosis, a decision, news that matters. And every second feels unbearable. You check the clock. 5 minutes have passed. It feels like 30. You try to distract yourself. Nothing works. The anxiety keeps pulling you back. And time refuses to move. Anxiety doesn't just make you uncomfortable. It makes time expand. Each moment feels longer because your mind is hypervigilant, scanning for threats, monitoring for changes, expecting the worst. And all of that processing amplifies your awareness of duration. When you're anxious, you can't stop thinking about the thing you're waiting for. Your attention loops. You replay scenarios. You imagine outcomes. You check for updates. And because your focus is locked on something that hasn't happened yet, you're hyper-aware of the gap. The space between now and when you'll finally know. That gap feels enormous. Time stretches to fill it. Not because the clock has slowed, but because your mind is processing the weight at maximum intensity. Every second registers. Every minute drags. And the more anxious you are, the worse it gets. This is why medical waiting rooms feel endless. Why the hours before an important conversation seem to crawl. Why anticipating bad news makes time feel like it's almost stopped. Anxiety keeps you locked in the present, but it's a miserable present. One where you're stuck between what you know and what you fear. The expansion comes from the attention you're giving it. If you could truly distract yourself, time would pass normally. But anxiety doesn't allow distraction. It pulls you back, forces you to keep thinking about the thing you're dreading. And the more you think about it, the more aware you are of how slowly time is passing. It creates a feedback loop. Anxiety makes time feel slow. The slow passage of time increases anxiety. And the cycle repeats until something finally resolves. Until the news comes. Until the moment you've been dreading or hoping for finally arrives. And when it does, the relief is immediate. Not just because the uncertainty is gone, but because time can finally move again. The expansion collapses. And you can stop monitoring every second. Novelty time stretching. The first day of a trip feels long. You're seeing new places, meeting new people. Everything is unfamiliar. By the end of the day, you're exhausted. And when you think back, it feels like the day lasted forever. But when you get home and fall back into routine, a week disappears before you notice. Novelty stretches time. Familiarity compresses it. The difference is in how much your brain has to process. When everything is new, your mind is working overtime. It's encoding details, noticing differences, building new memories, and all of that work makes the experience feel longer. This is why childhood seems endless. Almost everything is new when you're young. First day of school, first friend, first trip, first time riding a bike. Your brain is constantly encoding novel experiences. And because there's so much to remember, the time feels rich, full, extended. But as you age, novelty decreases. You've seen most of what you're going to see, done most of what you're going to do. Routines solidify. And when routines take over, your brain stops encoding as much. There's less to remember. So when you look back, the time feels compressed. The years blend together because there's less to distinguish one from the next. The effect is most obvious when you travel. A week somewhere new feels longer than a month at home. Not in the moment. In the moment, both pass at the same speed. But retrospectively, the week with novelty expands. It feels fuller because you encoded more. The month at home compresses because routine erased most of the detail. This is the paradox of time. If you want your life to feel longer in memory, you need novelty. You need new experiences, new challenges, new environments. The more you expose yourself to the unfamiliar, the richer your sense of time becomes. But novelty is exhausting. It requires attention, effort, energy. So most people default to routine. And routine makes time disappear. Not because it's bad, but because it's efficient. Your brain doesn't need to work as hard. And when it's not working, it's not encoding. And when it's not encoding, time compresses into nothing. Routine time compression. Monday looks like Tuesday. Tuesday looks like Wednesday. You do the same thing every day. Same commute, same desk, same lunch, same evening. And suddenly it's Friday. You blink and the week is gone. You can barely remember what happened. It all blurs together. Routine erases time, not in the moment, but in memory. When you do the same thing repeatedly, your brain stops paying attention. There's nothing new to encode. No surprises, no variations. Just the same pattern over and over. And without distinct moments to anchor your memory, the days collapse into a single indistinct stretch. This is why people say time speeds up as they get older. It's not that time actually accelerates. It's that life becomes more routine. You know what to expect. You've done it before. So your brain stops recording as much. And when you look back, there's almost nothing there. The weeks vanish because they were all the same. The compression happens retroactively. While you're in the routine, time moves normally. You're aware of the hours. You feel the day progress. But when you try to recall it later, the memory is thin. There's no detail, no texture. Just a vague sense that time passed, but you can't point to anything specific that happened. This is the cost of efficiency. Routine makes life easier. You don't have to think. You don't have to plan. You just follow the pattern. But the ease comes with a trade-off. The more routine your life becomes, the less of it you remember. And the less you remember, the faster it feels like time is passing. Breaking routine stretches time back out. A single day that's different, a trip, an unexpected event creates a memory marker. It stands out. And because it stands out, it makes the surrounding time feel longer. The week with one novel day feels fuller than the week where every day was identical. But most people don't break routine often enough. They fall into patterns and stay there. And the years start disappearing. Not because time is moving faster, but because routine has erased the evidence that it happened at all. Anticipation elongation. How long is the wait before something you've been looking forward to for months? Longer than anything else. The concert is next week. The trip is in 2 days. The event you've been counting down to is finally close. And somehow, that makes the wait worse. The closer it gets, the slower time feels. Anticipation does something strange to time. It doesn't make you less aware of it. It makes you more aware. You're checking the calendar, counting down the days, watching the clock. And all of that attention makes every hour feel longer. The excitement doesn't speed time up. It stretches it. The effect intensifies as the event approaches. A month away feels distant, manageable. But when it's down to days, then hours, the wait becomes excruciating. You're so close. And that proximity makes you hyper-aware of the gap. The space between now and the thing you want. And the awareness amplifies the drag. This is why the last few days before a vacation feel longer than the weeks before it. Why the hours before a big event seem to crawl. Why waiting for something you care about turns time into an obstacle. You're not just waiting. You're actively feeling the weight. And the more you care, the heavier it becomes. The strange part is that anticipation is supposed to be positive. You're excited. You're looking forward to it. But the emotional charge doesn't make time pass faster. It does the opposite. It locks your attention on the future. And the more focused you are on what's coming, the more painfully slow the present feels. Anticipation also changes how you experience the time leading up to the event. You can't fully engage with anything else. Everything becomes a placeholder. Something to get through until the real thing happens. So the days before don't feel meaningful on their own. They're just barriers. Time you have to endure. And then the event arrives. And it's over faster than you imagined. The thing you waited weeks for is done in hours. The anticipation stretched the wait. But the experience itself compresses. Because while you were anticipating, you were hyper-aware of time. But during the event, you're absorbed. And absorption makes time vanish. So you spend weeks feeling every slow second of the wait. And then the thing you waited for disappears in a blur. The anticipation elongated the approach. But it couldn't extend the experience itself. Pain duration bias. Pain lasts longer than it should. Not objectively, but in your head. A headache that goes on for an hour feels like it lasted 3. A painful medical procedure that took 15 minutes feels like it dragged on forever. And the worse the pain, the more time distorts. Your brain doesn't handle pain the same way it handles neutral experiences. Pain demands attention. It forces itself into focus. And because you can't ignore it, you can't stop tracking how long it's lasting. Every second of pain registers. Every moment drags. And that constant awareness makes duration feel extended. This is pain duration bias. The tendency to overestimate how long painful experiences last. It's not about intensity. It's about how pain monopolizes your attention. When something hurts, you can't think about anything else. You can't distract yourself. You can't escape. So time becomes something you're forced to endure. The distortion works in both directions. While you're in pain, time feels slow. Every minute stretches. You keep checking how much longer it will last. and the answer is always too long. But when you look back, the memory of pain also expands. An experience that lasted minutes feels like it went on for much longer, because the intensity of the memory makes it loom larger than it actually was. This is why people dread painful experiences more than they should. The anticipation is bad. The experience itself feels endless. And the memory afterward is worse than the reality. Pain doesn't just hurt in the moment. It distorts your entire sense of how long you suffered. It shows up in medical settings constantly. Patients overestimate the duration of procedures. They remember pain as lasting far longer than it did. And that inflated memory makes them more anxious about future treatments. The distortion compounds. Each painful experience feels worse in retrospect, which makes the next one more frightening in anticipation. The same thing happens with emotional pain. A difficult conversation. A breakup. A period of grief. While you're in it, time crawls. You can't imagine it ever ending. And when you look back, even years later, that period feels like it lasted forever. The pain stretched it. Made it heavier. Gave it more weight in your memory than the actual duration deserved. Pain doesn't just hurt. It hijacks time. And once it does, the experience becomes something you can't escape, can't forget, and can't accurately measure. The clock says one thing. Your memory says another. And the memory always wins. Peak in timing bias. 2 vacations. Same length, same cost. But one ends on a high note. The last day is perfect. Great weather. No stress. You leave satisfied. The other ends badly. Flight delays. Lost luggage. Exhaustion. You leave frustrated. When you remember them later, the one that ended well feels longer. Better. Worth repeating. The one that ended poorly feels shorter. Worse. Not worth the trouble. The actual duration was identical. But your memory doesn't care. It judges the experience based on 2 moments, the peak and the end. Everything else fades. The middle blurs. The details disappear. What stays is how intense it got and how it finished. And those 2 snapshots determine how you remember the entire duration. This is peak end bias. Your brain doesn't average experiences evenly. It weighs the extremes. The best moment. The final moment. And it uses those to reconstruct your overall impression. If the peak was high and the end was good, the experience feels positive. Even if most of it was mediocre. If the peak was painful and the end was bad, the experience feels negative. Even if large stretches were fine. Duration gets ignored. A short painful experience with a terrible ending feels worse than a longer painful experience that ends more gently. The extra time doesn't matter. What matters is the intensity and the closure. Your memory compresses everything into those 2 points and discards the rest. This shows up everywhere. Medical procedures feel worse if they end abruptly. Relationships are remembered based on how they ended, not how long they lasted. Jobs are judged by the final months, not the years before. The peak end rule dominates, and it distorts your sense of what actually happened. The effect also changes decisions. You avoid things that ended badly, even if most of the experience was fine. You chase things that ended well, even if most of the experience was forgettable. The snapshots replace the reality, and you make choices based on memories that barely resemble what you actually lived through. You think you're evaluating duration, but you're not. You're evaluating 2 moments, and those moments become the entire story. Duration neglect. You're asked to choose between 2 options. One is mildly unpleasant for 10 minutes. The other is mildly unpleasant for 10 minutes, then adds 3 more minutes that are slightly less unpleasant. Which sounds worse? Most people choose the shorter one. 10 minutes of discomfort sounds better than 13. But here's the strange part. When people actually experience both, they rate the longer one as less bad. Because it didn't end at peak discomfort. It tapered off. and that gentler ending made the whole thing feel more bearable, even though it lasted longer. Duration neglect. Your brain ignores how long something lasts and focuses on how it felt, especially at the end. A longer experience that ends on a softer note feels better than a shorter one that stops abruptly at the worst moment. The extra time doesn't hurt you. It helps, but only if it reduces the intensity before it ends. This flips how you'd expect decisions to work. Logically, less time suffering should always be better. But your memory doesn't operate on logic. It operates on emotional peaks and final impressions. And a slightly longer experience with a gentler ending leaves a better memory than a shorter one that ends harshly. The effect shows up in everything from dental work to breakups. A procedure that tapers the discomfort at the end is remembered as less painful than one that stops cold. A relationship that fades gradually feels less traumatic than one that ends abruptly. The length of the suffering matters less than the shape of it. You don't remember duration. You remember intensity. And because of that, adding time can actually improve the memory. As long as the added time lowers the peak or softens the ending, which means your intuition about what will feel worse is often backward. You think more time equals more suffering, but duration neglect says otherwise. What matters isn't how long, it's how hard, and how it ends. Time scarcity mindset. There's never enough time. You're always behind, always rushing, always aware of how much you still need to do, and how little time you have to do it. And that constant pressure changes everything. Not just how you feel, but how you think, how you decide, how you prioritize. Time scarcity creates tunnel vision. When you feel like time is running out, your focus narrows. You stop thinking long term. You stop planning. You stop considering trade-offs. All you see is the immediate problem, the urgent task, the thing that has to be done right now. And everything else gets ignored. This is the scarcity mindset, the mental state that emerges when you're operating under chronic time pressure. And it doesn't just make you stressed. It makes you less effective. You focus on putting out fires instead of preventing them. You make short-sighted decisions because there's no mental space left to think ahead. You sacrifice important work for urgent work, and the cycle reinforces itself. The mechanism is cognitive load. When your brain is constantly tracking how little time you have, it's using resources that would otherwise go toward planning, reflection, and strategic thinking. Scarcity hijacks attention. It forces you to focus on the deficit, and that focus leaves less capacity for everything else. This is why people who feel time-starved make worse decisions. Not because they're bad at deciding, but because the scarcity mindset doesn't allow the kind of thinking that leads to good decisions. You're reacting, not evaluating, choosing speed over quality, prioritizing completion over correctness, and missing opportunities because you're too focused on the immediate gap. The trap is that scarcity creates more scarcity. You're behind, so you rush. Rushing leads to mistakes. Mistakes create more work. More work makes you more behind, and the deficit grows. The mindset locks you into a reactive loop where you're always chasing time but never catching up. Breaking it requires stepping back, which feels impossible when you're already short on time. But without that step back, the scarcity mindset keeps narrowing your focus until you're trapped in a cycle where urgency is the only thing that matters. And urgency by itself doesn't move you forward. It just keeps you running. Temporal myopia. Ask someone what they'll be doing next month. They can tell you. Ask what they'll be doing next year. They have some idea. Ask what they'll be doing in 10 years. The answer gets vague, blurry, abstract. And their decisions reflect that blur. Temporal myopia. The inability to see the future clearly. The further out something is, the less real it feels. And the less real it feels, the less it affects your behavior. You can imagine tomorrow. You can plan for next week. But 5 years from now might as well be a different lifetime. It's too distant to shape what you do today. This is why people neglect long-term consequences. Not because they don't care, but because the future feels hypothetical. Saving for retirement sounds smart in theory, but retirement is decades away. It's abstract, fuzzy. It doesn't trigger the same urgency as paying rent this month. So the immediate need wins, and the future gets deferred. The myopia isn't about intelligence. It's about how your brain processes time. Near events feel concrete. They have weight. They demand attention. But distant events dissolve into vagueness. You know they're coming. But they don't feel pressing. They don't activate the same circuits. So they get deprioritized. This creates a systematic bias toward the short term. You choose immediate rewards over delayed ones. You avoid costs today even if they'll grow tomorrow. You defer problems because solving them now feels harder than letting future you deal with it. And the pattern compounds. Each short-term choice makes the long-term situation worse. But the long-term situation is too far away to feel like a crisis. So the cycle continues. Temporal myopia shows up in everything. Health, finances, relationships, career. Wherever the consequences are delayed, people struggle to act. Not because the consequences don't matter, but because distance erodes their psychological weight. The future version of the problem feels smaller than the present version of the effort. So the effort gets skipped. And the further into the future the consequences, the more it shrinks. A cost next month feels significant. A cost next year feels manageable. A cost in 10 years barely registers. The timeline doesn't just delay the impact. It makes the impact feel irrelevant, even when it's not. Future discounting under stress. When you're calm, you can think about the future. You can plan. You can weigh options. You can choose the path that's better in the long run, even if it's harder right now. But when you're stressed, that capacity collapses. The future stops mattering. All that matters is relief. Now, stress amplifies present bias. The more overwhelmed you are, the more you discount future outcomes. A reward next week loses value. A consequence next month feels irrelevant. The only thing that registers is what makes the present moment more bearable. And you'll sacrifice almost anything to get it. This is future discounting under stress. The tendency to devalue delayed outcomes when you're under pressure. And it's not a choice. It's automatic. Stress narrows your time horizon. It forces your focus onto the immediate, and everything beyond that immediate window fades into irrelevance. The mechanism is resource depletion. When you're stressed, your brain is working overtime just to manage the present. There's no capacity left for long-term thinking. Planning requires mental space. Evaluating trade-offs requires calm. But stress eliminates both. So you default to whatever offers short-term relief, even if the long-term cost is obvious. This is why people make terrible decisions under pressure. Overspending when money is tight. Skipping work when deadlines loom. Avoiding conflict when relationships need confrontation. The stressed brain doesn't compute future consequences the same way a calm brain does. It discounts them so heavily they might as well not exist. The effect gets worse the more chronic the stress becomes. Acute stress narrows focus temporarily, but chronic stress rewires how you evaluate time. The future starts feeling permanently distant, unreachable, not worth optimizing for. So you stop trying. You make choices that favor now over later, and the pattern locks in. And because stress itself creates more stress, the cycle reinforces. You make a short-sighted choice under pressure. That choice creates a future problem. The future problem increases stress, and the increased stress makes you even more short-sighted. The discount rate steepens. The future shrinks. And eventually you're living entirely in the present, because the future feels too far away to protect. Impatience Gradient. You're waiting for something. A package. A reply. An outcome. At first you're fine. You can wait. But as time passes, something shifts. You start checking more often. Refreshing the page. Looking at your phone. And the closer you get to when it should arrive, the more impatient you become. The gradient is real. Patience decreases as the endpoint approaches. The first hour of waiting is easy. The last 5 minutes are excruciating. Not because the wait is objectively harder, but because proximity amplifies urgency. When the thing you're waiting for is close, the delay feels worse. More frustrating, more unbearable. This is the impatience gradient, the pattern where your tolerance for delay drops as the expected resolution gets nearer. And it's not rational. The wait at the beginning and the wait at the end are the same duration. But the emotional experience is completely different. The closer you are to the end, the less patience you have left. The mechanism is anticipation. When the resolution is far away, it's abstract. You're not actively expecting it yet. But as it gets closer, your brain starts preparing. You shift into a state of readiness. And once you're in that state, any additional delay feels like an interruption. A barrier between you and the thing you're now primed to receive. This is why the last few minutes of a commute feel longer than the first few. Why the final days before a deadline are more stressful than the weeks before. Why waiting for food after you've ordered feels worse than waiting to decide what to order. The proximity changes the psychology. Distance allows patience. Nearness demands resolution. The gradient also explains why people give up right before the end. You've been waiting. You've invested time. But the last stretch feels unbearable, so you abandon it. Not because the total wait was too long, but because the final portion, when impatience peaks, became intolerable. The gradient made the end harder than the beginning, and it's self-reinforcing. The more impatient you become, the more you focus on the delay. The more you focus on it, the slower time feels. And the slower it feels, the more impatient you get. The gradient steepens until the final moments feel like the longest part of the entire wait. Even when they're not. Aversion. You see the line. 20 people ahead of you, maybe more. And immediately you're calculating. How long will this take? Is it worth it? Can you come back later? The answer is almost always no. You'd rather skip it entirely than stand there waiting. Even if what you're waiting for matters. Chaos trigger something visceral. It's not just the wait. It's the visibility of the wait. You can see exactly how many people are ahead of you. You can watch them move forward slowly. And that makes every second feel worse, because you're not just waiting. You're watching yourself wait. The aversion is psychological. Standing in line feels like lost time. Wasted time. Time you could be spending doing literally anything else. And the longer the line, the stronger the aversion. Even when the actual wait is short. Even when the thing at the end is worth it. The sight of the Caillou alone is enough to make you reconsider. This is why businesses obsess over Caillou management. It's not about reducing the actual wait time. It's about reducing the perceived wait. Distractions help. Entertainment helps. Anything that makes you less aware of the line makes the wait more tolerable. Because the problem isn't the duration. It's the awareness of it. The aversion also creates irrational decisions. You'll drive across town to avoid a 10-minute wait. You'll abandon a purchase rather than stand in line. You'll choose a worse option simply because it doesn't require queuing. The wait becomes the deciding factor, not the value of what you're waiting for. And it's worse when the wait feels uncertain. If you know the line will take 10 minutes, you can mentally prepare. But when you don't know how long it'll be, the uncertainty amplifies the aversion. You can't plan. You can't gauge whether it's worth it, so you default to avoidance. Key aversion doesn't care about logic. It's a reflexive response to visible delay, and once it triggers, the line becomes an obstacle worth avoiding, even when avoiding it costs you more than the wait ever would. Empty time intolerance, nothing to do. You're sitting, waiting. No phone, no book, no distraction. Just you and the passage of time. And it's unbearable. Not because anything is wrong, but because there's nothing to fill the space. And empty time feels heavier than occupied time. The human brain doesn't handle inactivity well. When there's nothing demanding your attention, your mind starts wandering. And wandering isn't peaceful. It's restless. You become hyper-aware of time. You start noticing every second. And the more you notice, the slower it feels. This is empty time intolerance. The inability to sit with unfilled moments without discomfort. It's why people reach for their phones the instant there's a gap. Why waiting rooms feel torturous. Why being alone with your thoughts for even a few minutes can feel like an eternity. The discomfort comes from a lack of distraction. When your attention is occupied, time disappears. You're engaged, focused. The hours pass without you noticing. But when there's nothing to engage with, your attention turns inward. And inward isn't always a comfortable place to be. Empty time also amplifies anxiety. When you have nothing to do, you start thinking. And thinking often means worrying. Replaying conversations. Imagining problems. Spiraling into concerns that wouldn't surface if you were distracted. The emptiness creates space for uncomfortable thoughts. And those thoughts make the time feel worse. This is why constant stimulation has become the norm. People can't tolerate gaps anymore. Every moment has to be filled. Every wait has to be occupied. The idea of just sitting, doing nothing, feels wrong. Wasteful. Like time that should be spent on something productive. Or at least something that keeps your mind busy. But the intolerance has a cost. You never rest. You never let your mind settle. You're always consuming. Always processing. Always moving to the next thing. And the inability to tolerate empty time means you never get the mental space that comes from just being still. Empty time isn't wasted. But it feels like it is. And that feeling is strong enough to make you fill every gap. Even when filling it doesn't actually make the time more valuable. Subjective time acceleration with age. Time speeds up as you get older. It's not your imagination. The years genuinely feel like they pass faster. Childhood stretched on forever. A summer felt endless. A year was a lifetime. But now summers vanish. Years blur. And you're left wondering where the time went. The acceleration is real. But it's not because time itself is moving faster. It's because your brain is encoding less. When you're young, almost everything is new. First day of school. First friend. First trip. Your mind is constantly recording, building memories. And all of that encoding makes time feel rich, extended, full. But as you age, novelty decreases. You've done most things before. Your routines solidify. And when life becomes predictable, your brain stops paying as much attention. There's less to encode. Fewer new experiences. Fewer distinct moments. So when you look back, there's less to remember. And the less you remember, the shorter the time feels. This is why a year in childhood feels longer than a year in adulthood. As a child, you're learning constantly. Everything is unfamiliar. So your brain is working overtime, encoding all of it. But as an adult, most of your days look the same. Same job. Same commute. Same routine. And repetition compresses memory. The brain doesn't bother recording what it's already seen. The effect compounds over time. The older you get, the more your life becomes routine. And the more routine it becomes, the faster time seems to pass. Not in the moment, but retrospectively. When you try to recall the year, There's barely anything there. It all blurs together, and that blur makes it feel like the year disappeared. Breaking the acceleration requires novelty, new experiences, new places, new challenges, anything that forces your brain to pay attention and encode. The more you expose yourself to the unfamiliar, the richer your sense of time becomes. The years feel fuller because there's more in them to remember. But most people don't do that. They settle into patterns. And the patterns make time vanish. Not because it's moving faster, but because they've stopped creating the memories that make it feel slow. Temporal self-discontinuity. Who are you in 10 years? Can you picture them? Do they feel like you? Or do they feel like someone else? A stranger. Someone whose life you can imagine but whose emotions you can't feel. Whose needs don't move you the way your own do. For most people, the future self is distant. Disconnected. You know intellectually that it's you. But emotionally they don't register the same way. And that disconnect creates a problem. When your future self feels like a stranger, you don't protect them. You don't prioritize their needs. You make decisions that favor you now at their expense. This is temporal self-discontinuity, the psychological gap between your present self and your future self. And the wider the gap, the less you care about what happens to them. You'll skip saving because future you will figure it out. Choose comfort today because future you stress feels abstract. Avoid difficult work because the version of you who'll face the consequences doesn't feel real enough to defend. The discontinuity isn't about logic. It's about emotional connection. Your present self is vivid, immediate. You feel their wants directly. But your future self exists only in imagination. You can't feel what they'll feel. You can't experience their regret. So they don't move you the way a real person standing in front of you would. And that creates a failure of empathy. You wouldn't ignore a friend's future struggles. You wouldn't dismiss someone else's long-term well-being. But your future self is abstract enough that you treat them the way you'd treat a stranger. With less concern, less protection. The gap grows with distance. The further into the future, the more disconnected they feel. Next month's version of you still feels somewhat like you. But 10 years from now, that person is practically hypothetical. Their problems don't activate the same concern. Their needs don't compete with yours. So you sacrifice their well-being without guilt. Some people have stronger continuity. They can vividly imagine their future. They feel connected to the person they'll become. And that connection changes everything. They save more. They plan better. They endure present discomfort because they genuinely care about the person who'll benefit from it. But for most, the future self is too far away. Too abstract. And that distance turns every decision into a choice between someone you know and someone you don't. Time fragmentation. Your day used to flow. One thing led to another. Tasks had beginnings and endings. You could settle into work, finish it, then move on. But now, everything is interrupted. A notification, a message, a meeting, another notification. You're never fully in one thing. You're always being pulled somewhere else. And by the end of the day, you can't remember what you actually did. Time doesn't feel whole anymore. It feels broken. Fragmented into dozens of tiny pieces. And those pieces don't add up to anything coherent. You were busy. You were moving. But when you try to recall the day, there's no continuous thread. Just a series of disconnected moments, interruptions, transitions, gaps. Fragmentation destroys your sense of time. When you're constantly switching between tasks, you never fully engage with any of them. You're always in transition, always reorienting. And that constant shifting makes time feel chaotic, unstructured, like it's slipping through your fingers. The effect is cognitive. Every time you switch tasks, your brain has to reset. It takes time to refocus, to rebuild the context of what you are doing. And that switching cost adds up, not just in productivity, but in how you experience duration. Fragmented time feels faster because you're never settled long enough to notice it passing. But it also feels emptier because you're not encoding depth, just surface-level moments. This is why people say they're busy but can't point to what they accomplished. The day was full, but it was full of fragments, and fragments don't create a sense of meaningful time. They create a sense of chaos, of time being consumed without purpose. The fragmentation also makes memory worse. When your attention is constantly divided, you're not encoding properly. You're skimming, moving on before the moment solidifies. So when you look back, there's barely anything there. The day disappears because it was never whole to begin with. Reversing fragmentation requires protecting blocks of time, uninterrupted time, time where you're allowed to settle into one thing and stay there. Without that, time keeps breaking apart, and broken time doesn't feel like time at all. It just feels like noise. Multitasking time illusion. You're doing 3 things at once. Responding to emails while on a call while reviewing a document. You feel efficient, productive, like you're making the most of every second. But when the hour is over, nothing is actually done. The email is half finished. The call was a blur. The document still needs another pass. You were busy, but you weren't effective. Multitasking creates an illusion. It makes you feel like you're saving time, accomplishing more. But the opposite is true. You're not doing multiple things simultaneously. You're rapidly switching between them. And every switch costs time, attention, quality. The brain can't fully focus on more than one demanding task at a time. When you try, you're splitting your attention, giving each task a fraction of your capacity. And that fraction isn't enough to do any of them well. So everything takes longer, requires more effort, and produces worse results. But the illusion persists, because multitasking feels productive. You're in motion. You're responding. You're active. And activity feels like progress. Even when it isn't, the constant switching creates a sense of urgency, of getting things done. But when you step back and assess what actually got completed, the list is short. The time illusion also distorts perception. When you're multitasking, time feels like it's passing quickly. You're busy, moving, engaged. So you assume you're being efficient. But the speed you feel isn't efficiency. It's chaos. You're moving fast, but you're not moving forward. This is why people who multitask constantly feel like they never have enough time. They're always working, always busy, but the work doesn't finish. Because multitasking fragments focus, and fragmented focus means tasks take longer than they should. The time you thought you were saving by doing everything at once gets eaten by the cost of switching. The real cost is hidden. You don't notice the seconds lost refocusing, the errors that require rework, the depth you sacrifice by skimming instead of engaging. But those costs accumulate, and what felt like time saved becomes time wasted. Multitasking doesn't multiply your capacity. It divides it, and divided attention doesn't save time. It just makes every task worse. Underestimation of task time. It'll take an hour, maybe 2. You've done this before. You know how it works. So you schedule accordingly. Block out the time. Start the task. 3 hours later, you're still not done. The estimate wasn't even close. And you're left scrambling, wondering where the time went. You consistently underestimate how long things take. Not because you're careless, but because when you imagine doing the task, you picture the ideal version. The one where everything goes smoothly, where you work without interruption, where nothing unexpected comes up. And that version feels accurate, so you base your estimate on it. But reality includes friction. You get stuck on a detail. You realize something is more complicated than you thought. You have to backtrack, redo parts, handle interruptions you didn't plan for. And all of that eats time. Time you never accounted for because it didn't exist in your mental simulation. When you estimate duration, you're not predicting the task as it will actually unfold. You're predicting an idealized path through it, and that path almost never happens. There are always complications, small delays, unexpected challenges, things that slow you down in ways you didn't anticipate. This shows up everywhere. Projects that run over, trips that take longer than expected, tasks you thought would be quick that consume your afternoon. You weren't lying to yourself. You genuinely believed the estimate. But you were estimating the best case, not the average one. The underestimation gets worse when you're under pressure. The more you need the task to be fast, the more you convince yourself it will be. You shrink the estimate to fit your timeline, not reality. And when it inevitably takes longer, you're caught unprepared. The pattern repeats because you never adjust for the gap. Every time, you think this time will be different. This time, things will go smoothly. But they don't. And the cycle continues. The task always takes longer than you think, because you're not accounting for everything that makes reality messier than imagination. Planning fallacy in time. You plan the day, morning meetings, afternoon work, evening errands. It looks manageable on paper. But by noon, you're already behind. The first meeting ran long. The second task took more focus than expected. And suddenly, the carefully structured day has collapsed into chaos. You're not lazy. You're not slow. The plan was just wrong. The planning fallacy. The systematic bias toward underestimating how long things will take and overestimating how much you can accomplish. And it's not occasional. It's consistent. Almost every plan you make assumes more efficiency than you'll actually have. More focus. Fewer interruptions. Less resistance. The fallacy happens because planning activates a different mental mode than execution. When you plan, you're thinking abstractly. You're organizing tasks, estimating durations. But you're not feeling the effort. You're not experiencing the friction. So the plan feels reasonable, achievable, even easy. But execution is concrete. It includes all the things planning ignores. The mental fatigue that builds as the day progresses. The unexpected problems. The decisions that take longer than you thought. The transitions between tasks that eat minutes you didn't budget for. And because the plan didn't account for any of that, it falls apart the moment reality starts. This is why people consistently overschedule. They look at the day and think they can fit everything in. And on paper, they can. But paper doesn't include the cost of context switching, the energy drain of difficult work, the small delays that compound. So the plan, which seemed tight but doable, becomes impossible the moment you try to execute it. The fallacy also creates stress. You're always behind, not because you're inefficient, but because the plan was unrealistic from the start. And being behind makes you rush, cut corners, sacrifice quality for speed, which often creates more work later. So the fallacy doesn't just make you late. It makes you worse at the work itself. Breaking the pattern requires building slack into the plan. Assuming things will take longer than you think. Scheduling fewer tasks than feels optimal. But that feels wasteful. Like you're not making full use of your time. So most people don't do it. They keep planning as if this time will be different, and it never is. Postponement time illusion. Tomorrow. You'll do it tomorrow. Tomorrow you'll have more energy, more focus, more time. Tomorrow feels better, easier. Like the version of the task that exists tomorrow will be less demanding than the version that exists today. So you defer, and tomorrow arrives. and it's exactly the same. But by then, you've already decided to push it to the next day. Postponement creates an illusion. It makes you believe that delaying will somehow make the task easier. That future you will be more capable, more motivated, more ready. But future you is the same person, facing the same task, with the same challenges. The only difference is that now there's less time and more pressure. The illusion works because the future feels abstract. When you imagine doing something tomorrow, you're not feeling the resistance. You're not experiencing the difficulty. It's hypothetical, so it feels lighter, more manageable. And that gap between how it feels now and how you imagine it will feel later makes postponement seem rational. But the task doesn't change. The effort required stays the same. The only thing that changes is the deadline. And as the deadline gets closer, the pressure increases. So you've traded present discomfort for future stress. And convinced yourself it was a good trade because the future version felt easier to imagine than the present version felt to start. This is why chronic procrastinators keep postponing. Not because they're lazy, but because every time they defer, the future version feels like it will be better. And by the time the future becomes the present, they've already formed the habit of pushing it forward again. The illusion never breaks, because they never stay in the present long enough to realize that tomorrow's version of the task is identical to today's. The cost compounds. Each postponement shrinks the available time, increases the urgency, adds stress, and eventually you're working under pressure you could have avoided. Not because the task was difficult, but because the illusion made you believe that waiting would make it easier. And it never does. Last-minute urgency spike. The deadline is close, too close. And suddenly, everything sharpens. You're moving faster, thinking clearer. The distractions that consumed you all week disappear. You're locked in, focused, working harder than you have in days. And you wonder, why couldn't I do this earlier? Last-minute urgency is real. The pressure of an approaching deadline activates a level of focus and intensity you can't generate when time feels abundant. It's not that you're suddenly more capable. It's that the deadline makes the cost of delay immediate, tangible, unavoidable. And that immediacy overrides everything else. When the deadline is far away, it doesn't feel real. There's no immediate consequence to putting it off. So other things take priority. Easier tasks, less demanding work, distractions that wouldn't stand a chance if the deadline were tomorrow. But with time to spare, they win. The distant deadline doesn't activate the urgency you need to push through resistance. But as the deadline closes in, the pressure builds. The buffer shrinks. What was once 2 weeks is now 2 days. And 2 days isn't enough to be careless. So you shift. You cut the distractions. You focus. You work faster. Not because you've gained new skills, but because the urgency has finally become strong enough to override inertia. The spike feels productive. And in some ways, it is. You're accomplishing more in less time. You're cutting through decisions you'd normally agonize over. You're prioritizing ruthlessly. But you're also working in crisis mode. And crisis mode has costs. You're skipping steps, making errors, delivering something functional but not optimal. The spike also reinforces bad habits. Every time you procrastinate and still meet the deadline, you learn that the last-minute push works. So you repeat it. The urgency becomes your default productivity mode. Not because it's better, but because it's the only thing that generates enough pressure to overcome delay. And the pattern locks in. You can't start early because early doesn't feel urgent. So you wait. And the waiting guarantees you'll always be working under pressure. Always rushing, always operating at the edge of your capacity. The spike gets the work done. But it also ensures you're perpetually stressed. Reward delay sensitivity. A small reward now, or a larger reward later? Which do you choose? Most people take the smaller one. Not because they don't want the larger reward, but because later feels too far away, too uncertain. The delay makes the bigger reward lose value, and the smaller one, because it's immediate, feels more real. Reward delay sensitivity. The tendency to devalue outcomes based on how far away they are. The further out the reward, the less it affects your behavior. Even when waiting is objectively better, even when the delayed reward is significantly larger, the gap in time shrinks its psychological weight until it can't compete with something you can have right now. The mechanism is emotional proximity. Immediate rewards trigger a visceral response. You can feel them, imagine them, almost taste them. But delayed rewards exist only in theory. You know they're coming, but they don't activate the same circuits. They don't create the same pull. So even when logic says wait, emotion says take it now. This is why saving feels impossible, why diets fail, why long-term goals get sacrificed for short-term comfort. The future benefit is real, but it's distant, and distance erodes its power. The immediate option, even when it's smaller, feels more valuable because it's certain and close. The sensitivity also explains inconsistent behavior. You'll choose the larger delayed reward when both options are far away. But as the immediate option gets closer, your preference flips. Not because the rewards changed, but because proximity changed how much weight you gave them. The closer reward suddenly feels more important, more real, and logic loses to immediacy. Delay sensitivity isn't about patience. It's about how your brain processes value across time. And the processing is automatic. You're not consciously deciding that immediate is better. Your emotional system is making that decision for you. By the time you're aware of the choice, the preference has already formed. The only way to override it is to change the framing. Make the delayed reward feel more immediate. Visualize it. Connect it to something concrete. Give it emotional weight. Because without that, delay will always diminish value, and the smaller immediate option will always win. Temporal uncertainty stress. You don't know when it'll be done. Could be an hour, could be all day. You can't plan. You can't relax. You're stuck in a state of waiting without knowing how long the wait will last. And that uncertainty is worse than a long wait with a clear endpoint. Because at least with a clear endpoint, you can mentally prepare. But uncertainty keeps you on edge, unable to settle, unable to move on. Temporal uncertainty creates stress in a way that predictable time doesn't. When you know exactly how long something will take, you can adapt. You can plan around it. You can decide whether to wait or come back later. But when the timeline is vague, you're trapped. You can't commit to waiting because it might take too long. But you can't leave because it might finish any moment. The stress comes from the inability to resolve. You're in limbo, not fully engaged with the wait, not free to do something else. Just hovering in a state of readiness that drains energy without producing anything. And the longer the uncertainty lasts, the more exhausting it becomes. This is why variable wait times feel worse than long fixed ones. A procedure that takes an hour feels manageable if you know it'll take an hour. But a procedure that might take anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours feels unbearable. Even if it ends up being shorter. Because the uncertainty kept you anxious the entire time. The stress also amplifies other emotions. If you're anxious, uncertainty makes it worse. If you're frustrated, uncertainty intensifies it. Because you can't gauge progress. You can't tell if you're halfway through or just starting. And without that sense of progress, every moment feels static, like nothing is moving forward. Uncertainty also makes you check constantly, refreshing the page, asking for updates, looking for signs that something has changed. And every check that yields nothing increases the frustration. The uncertainty makes you hypervigilant. and hypervigilance is exhausting. The only relief comes when the uncertainty resolves, when you finally know. Even if the answer is that it'll take longer than you hoped, at least you can plan. You can adjust. You can stop hovering in that uncomfortable state of not knowing. Because knowing, even when it's bad news, is better than the stress of waiting without any idea when it'll end. Event density effect. 2 weeks. Same duration, but one is packed. Meetings, deadlines, travel, new people, constant motion. The other is quiet, routine work, few interruptions, predictable days. When you look back, the busy week feels longer, like it lasted a month. The quiet one feels like it passed in days. Same amount of time, completely different memory. Event density determines how you remember duration. The more distinct moments you encode, the longer the period feels in retrospect. A week full of varied experiences creates more mental markers. More things to anchor your memory, so when you recall it, there's more there. And that richness makes the time feel extended. But a week of sameness creates almost no markers. The days blend together. There's nothing to distinguish Monday from Thursday. So in memory, the whole week compresses into a single indistinct stretch. It feels brief because there's barely anything to remember. This is why eventful periods feel longer than they were. Not in the moment. While you're living through them, they might even feel rushed. But retrospectively, they expand. Because your brain encoded so much, and the density of what you experienced makes the time feel fuller, heavier, more substantial. The opposite happens with low-density periods. Routine erases detail. When every day looks the same, your brain stops recording. There's no reason to encode what's already known. So the days vanish. Not because they didn't happen, but because there's nothing in memory to prove they did. This creates a paradox. If you want your life to feel longer when you look back, you need density. You need variation, new experiences, different patterns. The more you expose yourself to novelty, the richer your retrospective sense of time becomes. But density is exhausting. It requires attention, energy, engagement. So most people default to routine, and routine makes years disappear. The effect compounds over a lifetime. Eventful years feel long in memory. Routine years vanish. And when you look back at decades, the periods you remember are the ones where things were happening. The rest compresses into nothing. Not because the time wasn't there, but because the events weren't. Memory-based time compression. You remember the highlights, the peaks, the moments that stood out, but the middle, the transitions, the stretches where nothing remarkable happened, they're gone. And without them, the experience feels shorter than it was. You know it lasted weeks, but in memory it feels like days. Because most of what happened didn't make it into storage. Memory compresses time by discarding the ordinary. Your brain doesn't preserve everything. It filters. It keeps what's emotionally significant, what's novel, what's intense, and it lets the rest fade. So when you reconstruct the past, you're working with fragments, highlights separated by gaps. And those gaps make the duration feel condensed. This is why long projects feel short in retrospect. While you were working, every day felt real. You were there. You remember the effort. But when you look back, only the key moments remain. The difficult problem you solved, the breakthrough, the final push. Everything in between has blurred into background. And without the middle, the timeline collapses. The compression happens automatically. You're not choosing what to forget. Your brain is making that decision based on what seemed important at the time. And most moments don't cross that threshold. They were fine, necessary, but not memorable, so they get filtered out. And what's left is a condensed version of the experience. One that feels shorter because the connective tissue is missing. This creates a mismatch. You know intellectually how long something took. You can count the weeks, the months. But emotionally, it doesn't feel that long, because the memory is sparse, and sparse memories don't carry the weight of full duration. The effect also changes how you evaluate experiences. A vacation that was mostly pleasant but unremarkable feels short, even if it was 2 weeks, because you remember the airport, the first day, maybe one standout meal, and the rest has compressed into a vague sense of being there. The duration existed, but the memory doesn't reflect it. Memory-based compression isn't about forgetting. It's about how your brain prioritizes storage. And in that prioritization, most of time gets left behind. What remains are the moments that mattered. And those moments, strung together without context, make everything feel faster than it was. Slow waiting if fast living contrast. Waiting drags. You're stuck, watching the clock. Every minute feels like 5. But when you're busy living, doing things that matter, time vanishes. You look up, and hours have passed. Same clock, same duration, but the experience couldn't be more different. The contrast is stark. When you're waiting, time feels like an obstacle, something to endure. You're hyper-aware of it, checking constantly, feeling every second. But when you're engaged, time becomes invisible. It's there. But you're not monitoring it. You're absorbed in what you're doing. And that absorption makes duration disappear. The difference is attention. Waiting forces you to focus on time itself. There's nothing else to hold your mind, so you track it. And tracking amplifies awareness. Every minute registers. Every delay feels magnified. But engagement pulls your attention away from time. You're not monitoring duration because your focus is locked on the task, the conversation, the work. And without that monitoring, time compresses. This creates the paradox of lived experience. The moments you want to last, the ones where you're fully present and engaged, pass the fastest. The moments you want to end, the ones where you're stuck waiting, drag on forever. Not because time itself is changing speed, but because your relationship to it is completely different. The contrast also shapes how you remember. Waiting, because it feels so slow, often compresses in memory. You remember it being tedious, but not how long it actually was, because there's nothing to encode, just the awareness of delay. But living, even though it feels fast, can expand in memory, because you were encoding actively, creating markers, building a record of what happened, so the experience inverts. What felt slow becomes short in memory. What felt fast becomes long. And the contrast between lived time and remembered time is often the opposite of what you'd expect. Circadian time perception drift. Time doesn't feel the same all day. Morning hours feel different from afternoon hours. Evening feels different from late night. And it's not just fatigue. It's your internal clock. Your circadian rhythm, shifting how you perceive duration based on where you are in the day's cycle. Mornings often feel slower, more deliberate. The hours of wait. But afternoons can feel faster. The day is moving. You're in the middle of tasks. And the time between lunch and evening compresses. Not because you're doing more, but because your brain is processing time differently based on your biological rhythm. Late night has its own distortion. Time can feel elastic, stretching or compressing unpredictably. Part of it is fatigue. But part of it is that your circadian system, which helps regulate your sense of time, is preparing for rest. And that preparation changes how duration registers. The drift isn't dramatic, it's subtle. But over the course of a day, the variations add up. An hour in the morning doesn't feel quite the same as an hour at midnight. The clock says they're identical, but your experience says otherwise. This creates planning problems. You estimate how long something will take based on your current state. But if you're planning a morning task in the evening, or vice versa, your estimate will be off, because you're predicting duration in one circadian state while planning to execute in another. And the two don't align. The drift also affects productivity. Some people are sharper in the morning. Time feels more structured, more manageable. Others peak in the afternoon or evening, and their sense of time aligns with that peak. When you're working against your rhythm, time feels heavier. Tasks take longer. Not because they're harder, but because your internal clock is out of sync with the demands. The effect is biological. Your circadian system regulates more than sleep. It influences attention, energy, and how your brain processes temporal information. And as that system cycles through the day, your perception of time drifts along with it. Not wildly, but enough that the same duration can feel noticeably different depending on when it occurs. Attention-captured timing. You're watching something, completely absorbed. A film, a conversation, a task that holds your focus, and time disappears. You're not tracking it. You're not aware of it. You're just present. Then it ends. You check the time, and you're shocked. Hours have passed. You had no idea. Attention-captured timing. When your focus is fully occupied, you lose your sense of duration. Not because time is moving faster, but because you're not monitoring it. And without monitoring, there's no sense of how much has passed. You're existing in a continuous present. One long unbroken now. The capture is complete. There's no spare attention left to track time. Everything is going toward the thing you're engaged with. And that total occupation makes time vanish. You're not aware of minutes. You're not aware of hours. You're just in the experience. And the experience feels timeless. This is why immersive activities compress time. A good book. A compelling show. Deep work. Intense conversation. While you're in them, duration doesn't exist. You're fully present. And that presence erases your awareness of the clock. It's only when something breaks the immersion that you realize how much time has passed. The effect is strongest when the engagement is voluntary and enjoyable. When you're forced to focus on something you don't care about, time doesn't vanish the same way. You're aware of the effort, the resistance. And that awareness keeps you tethered to duration. But when focus is effortless, when it's something you want to be doing, the capture is total. And time goes with it. The loss of time awareness isn't a bug. It's a feature. It means you're fully engaged, not divided, not distracted, just present. And that presence is what makes the experience valuable. But it also means you can lose entire afternoons without realizing it. Not because you wasted them, but because you were so absorbed you stopped tracking how they were passing. Temporal overload. Everything needs to happen. Now. Deadlines are stacking, tasks are piling, and you're running out of time. Not just for today, for this week, this month. There's too much. And no matter how fast you move, you can't keep up. The pressure doesn't just make you stressed. It changes how you experience time itself. When you're overloaded, time starts feeling scarce, urgent, slipping away faster than you can use it. Every hour feels shorter because there's more to fit into it than it can hold. And that scarcity creates a desperation, a sense that you're always behind, always racing, never catching up. Temporal overload isn't just about having too much to do. It's about feeling like time itself is insufficient, like no matter how efficiently you work, there will never be enough hours. And that feeling warps your relationship to duration. Time stops being a resource you manage. It becomes a deficit you can't overcome. The overload also fragments attention. You're not fully present in any task because you're aware of all the others waiting. So you're always partially somewhere else, thinking about what's next, what's still undone. And that division makes everything take longer. which makes the overload worse, which makes time feel even more scarce. It creates a vicious cycle. The more overloaded you feel, the more rushed you become. The more rushed, the less effective. The less effective, the more tasks pile up. And the more they pile up, the worse the overload feels. Time compresses under the weight. And you end up in a state where every moment feels like crisis. Like there's never enough. Never will be. The stress isn't just emotional. It's temporal. You're not just overwhelmed by tasks. You're overwhelmed by the sensation that time is running out. And that sensation makes it impossible to settle, to focus, to work steadily, because you're always aware of the deficit, the gap between what you need to do and what time allows. Breaking temporal overload requires more than clearing tasks. It requires changing the relationship to time, slowing down the internal sense of urgency, building slack, creating space. But when you're in the middle of it, that feels impossible, because the overload makes you believe there's no time for space, no time for breathing room, only time for more work. And that belief keeps the cycle locked. Deadline blindness. The deadline is next week. Plenty of time. You've got it under control. Days pass. Still fine. Then suddenly, it's tomorrow. And you're scrambling. How did that happen? The deadline was visible the entire time, but somehow it didn't feel real until it was too late. Deadline blindness. The inability to feel the urgency of a deadline until it's nearly arrived. You know it's coming. You can see it on the calendar. But knowing doesn't translate into action. The deadline sits there, distant and abstract, until proximity makes it impossible to ignore. The blindness isn't about forgetting. You remember the deadline. You're aware of it. But awareness doesn't create urgency. Distance does something to your brain. It makes consequences feel hypothetical, manageable, like something future you will handle. And because future you doesn't feel pressing, present you doesn't act. This is why people procrastinate even when they know the cost. The deadline is visible, but it's not real. Not yet. It exists in the same category as things that might happen. Things you'll deal with eventually. And eventually keeps getting pushed back until eventually becomes now. And now is too late. The blindness also creates false security. You have time. You checked. The deadline is days away. So you delay. And each day you delay, you still have time. Right up until you don't. The transition from plenty of time to coat of time happens faster than you expect. Because the deadline didn't feel real until it was close enough to trigger panic. And once panic hits, you're working in crisis mode. Rushed. Stressed. Making errors. Sacrificing quality. All of which could have been avoided if the deadline had felt real earlier. But it didn't. Because distance creates blindness. And blindness creates delay. And delay creates crisis. The pattern repeats because the blindness is automatic. You can't force a distant deadline to feel urgent. Your brain doesn't work that way. Proximity triggers urgency. Distance suppresses it. So until the deadline is close, it stays invisible. Not to your eyes, but to the part of your brain that decides when to act. Future neglect. Why save for retirement when rent is due this month? Why exercise today when the health consequences are decades away? Why start early when the deadline still feels far? The future matters. You know it matters. But it doesn't move you. Not the way the present does. Future neglect. The systematic tendency to deprioritize long-term needs in favor of immediate ones. It's not that you don't care about the future. It's that the future doesn't feel urgent. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't create pressure. So it loses. Every time, the neglect happens because your brain is wired to respond to what's immediate and tangible. A problem right now activates stress, concern, action. But a problem 10 years from now, That's abstract. It exists in theory, and theory doesn't trigger the same response. So you defer. You tell yourself you'll handle it later, and later keeps getting pushed back. This shows up everywhere. Financial decisions, health choices, career planning, relationship maintenance. Wherever the consequences are delayed, people struggle to act, not because they're short-sighted, but because the future doesn't compete with the present on emotional weight. The present is vivid. The future is vague, and vague loses. The neglect compounds. Each time you prioritize now over later, the future problem grows. But it's still in the future, so it still doesn't feel urgent, and the cycle continues. You're aware the problem is getting worse, but awareness doesn't override the immediate pull of present needs. And by the time the future becomes the present, the damage is done. The retirement you didn't save for, the health you didn't maintain, the opportunities you didn't prepare for, they all arrive, and they're no longer abstract. But by then, it's too late to go back and make different choices. Future neglect isn't a failure of intelligence. It's a failure of emotional proximity. The future you is too far away to feel real, so their needs don't register with the weight they should. And present you, who feels real, makes decisions that favor now, because now is the only thing that moves you. Short-term relief preference. The problem is stressful. You could solve it. But solving it requires effort, discomfort, confrontation, things you'd rather avoid right now. So you don't solve it. You defer it, push it aside, find something easier to do. And immediately you feel better. The stress fades. The discomfort goes away. Relief, but the problem is still there. And deferring made it worse. Now there's less time. More pressure. The solution, when you finally face it, will be harder than it'd have been if you'd acted earlier. But that's future you's problem. Right now you feel better. And better feels like the right choice. Short-term relief preference. The tendency to choose actions that reduce stress now, even when those actions create more stress later. It's not rational. You know delaying makes things worse. But the relief is immediate. And immediate relief is more compelling than future consequences. The preference works because your brain values emotional state over outcomes. When you're stressed, your system wants relief. And it wants it now. The fastest way to get relief is to avoid the stressor. So you do. You defer the hard conversation. You skip the difficult task. You procrastinate. And the stress drops. Mission accomplished. But the relief is temporary. The problem didn't go away. It's just not in your face anymore. And because it's not visible, it feels handled. Not solved, but not pressing. So you move on, and the cycle repeats. Every time stress builds, you choose relief. And every time you choose relief, the underlying problem grows. The pattern locks in because the relief is real. You're not imagining it. You genuinely feel better when you defer. And that positive reinforcement makes the behavior automatic. Stress appears. You defer. Relief follows. Your brain learns deferring works, and it keeps choosing deferring, even when long-term it doesn't. Breaking the preference requires tolerating discomfort, facing the problem instead of avoiding it. But when you're stressed, tolerance is the last thing you have. So you take the relief, and the future cost keeps accumulating, invisible, until it's not. Temporal regret. You look back, and you see it clearly. The decision you made, the opportunity you missed, the time you wasted. If you could go back, you'd choose differently, but you can't. The moment is gone, and all that's left is the awareness of what you should have done and didn't. Temporal regret. The pain of recognizing too late that time was spent badly, that choices were made without understanding their cost. That what felt right in the moment turned out to be wrong. And now there's no way to undo it. The regret is sharp because it involves lost time. And time is irretrievable. You can fix mistakes. You can make amends. But you can't get back the years you spent on the wrong path, the months you procrastinated, the moments you let slip by without recognizing their value. They're gone. And the awareness of that loss sits heavy. Temporal regret often comes from misaligned priorities. You prioritized work over relationships, comfort over growth, immediate satisfaction over long-term goals. And at the time, those priorities felt reasonable. But looking back, you see the trade-offs clearly. What you gained wasn't worth what you lost. And the realization hurts. The regret also comes from inaction. The things you didn't do, the risks you didn't take, the conversations you avoided, the opportunities you let pass because the timing didn't feel right. And now, years later, you see that the timing was fine. You were just scared, and that fear cost you time you can't recover. What makes temporal regret particularly painful is the clarity. In the moment, decisions feel ambiguous, uncertain. But in hindsight, the right choice is obvious. You can see exactly where you went wrong, exactly what you should have done. And that clarity makes the regret worse. Because you can't claim ignorance, you just chose poorly. And the time you lost is proof. The regret doesn't undo the past. But it changes the future. You become more aware of how you're spending time, more cautious about deferring what matters, more willing to act even when it's uncomfortable, because you've felt the cost of waiting, and you don't want to feel it again. Time horizon narrowing. You used to think about next year, 5 years from now, where you'd be, what you'd build. But lately the horizon has shrunk. You're thinking about next week, next month. The future beyond that feels too uncertain, too far. So you stop planning for it. You focus on what's close, what's manageable, and the long-term fades into irrelevance. Time horizon narrowing. The contraction of how far into the future you're willing to think and plan. And it doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual. Stress narrows it. Uncertainty narrows it. Overwhelm narrows it. And bit by bit, your planning window shrinks until you're operating almost entirely in the short term. The narrowing is a response to cognitive load. When you're overwhelmed, long-term planning feels impossible. You don't have the mental resources to think 5 years ahead when you're barely managing today. So you stop. You focus on what's immediate, what's pressing, and everything beyond that gets deferred. But the narrowing creates problems. When you stop planning long-term, you stop making decisions that serve your future. You default to short-term optimization. And short-term optimization often conflicts with long-term goals. You're solving for now, not for later. And later suffers because no one is thinking about it. The horizon also narrows under threat. Financial stress, job insecurity, health concerns. When the present feels unstable, the future feels irrelevant. You can't think about retirement when you're worried about making rent. You can't plan a career when you're trying to survive the week. The narrowing is protective, but it's also limiting. And once the horizon narrows, it's hard to expand it again. Even when the immediate crisis passes, the habit of short-term thinking persists. You've trained yourself to focus on what's close, and that focus becomes default. The future stays blurry, not because you can't think about it, but because you've stopped trying. The cost accumulates slowly. Missed opportunities, neglected relationships, underdeveloped skills. All the things that require long-term thinking to build. They don't collapse immediately, but over time, the absence of long-term planning creates a deficit. And by the time you notice, the horizon has been narrow for so long you've forgotten what it's like to think beyond next month. Subjective passage of time. Time doesn't pass at a constant rate, not in your experience. Some days feel endless. Others vanish. A year in childhood felt longer than a decade in adulthood. And the older you get, the faster it seems to go. Not because the clock is speeding up, but because your relationship to time is changing. The subjective passage of time is shaped by how much you're encoding. When you're young, everything is new. Your brain is constantly recording, building memories, and that density of encoding makes time feel slower, fuller, richer. But as you age, novelty decreases, routines take over, and repetition compresses time. The brain stops recording what it already knows, so the years start disappearing. This is why travel makes time feel longer, why new experiences stretch duration, why breaking routine temporarily slows the passage. You're encoding again, creating markers, and those markers give time weight. But when you return to routine, the compression resumes, and time speeds back up. The passage is also affected by attention. When you're present, engaged, absorbed, time can feel either very fast or very slow depending on the context. Flow makes it vanish. Boredom stretches it. But when you're distracted, half present, not really engaged with anything, time becomes a blur. You're not tracking it, not encoding it. So it slips by without leaving much behind. And the emotional quality of time changes its passage. Happy periods often feel like they pass quickly. Difficult periods can drag. But in memory, the pattern sometimes inverts. A happy time that flew by feels long in retrospect because you encoded so much joy. A difficult time that dragged can compress in memory because you're not holding on to the details. The subjective passage is also about perspective. When you're 10, a year is 10% of your life. Huge. Significant. But when you're 50, a year is 2%. A smaller fraction. And the proportional difference makes it feel lighter. Less substantial. Not because the year is shorter, but because it represents less of your total experience. You can't stop time from passing, but you can change how it feels. More novelty, more presence, more encoding. And the passage slows, not objectively, but subjectively, which is the only passage that matters. Because time as you experience it is the only time you'll ever actually live.